Hi everyone, as promised, here is my full review of Outward's Definitive Edition. I needed a little bit more game time in order to deliver something that would really be objective. I also took the time to talk to some other people and watch a few streams to get a broader overview of the Definitive Edition, as I obviously did not play with a very huge amount of different builds you can make in this game. Obviously, I will repeat a few things I have already said in my first impression video. But now that I have more game time and that the explosive dopamine burst of the launch is down, my opinion will be more objective. I will divide this video in two parts. The first part will be a review addressed to new players who might want to give this game a chance and hesitate between Outward's regular edition and the Definitive Edition. In the second part, I will go more in depth and show a little bit of the new content for returning players and more experienced ones. Outward is an action RPG that describes itself as an adventurer's life simulator. It is a game that values preparation and careful exploration. This game has a very high replayability as the build diversity it offers is very high and your gameplay will completely change in every run. It has an interesting lore you mainly discover through exploration and observations. There are some survival mechanics, but nothing too demanding. The purpose of the Definitive Edition was to provide a more smoothed out version of the game by making sure the DLC content and the base game are mixed for a more seamless experience. Some balance changes has also been made, making the Definitive Edition slightly harder for new players, but the difference is really not that high. Some enemies that are supposed to be a threat really are now, and it just makes more sense. You will now have a harder time killing the rare big and strong enemies in the very early game, but the scaling has not changed much. I would argue that some changes contribute to making the player even stronger than before, especially if you are using some heavy armor. There has been quite a few changes to the atmosphere of the game. The lighting has been improved on the already very solid base, and a lot of ambient sounds have been added, making the game feel more alive than before. There has also been some quality of life changes, like shared stashes between houses and a clearer game menu. Overall, the Definitive Edition is really worth getting over the base game version. You get the DLC content, some more mini-bosses to fight in every dungeon, and it makes every single one of these worth exploring now. The balance changes make the game more interesting and allow more pieces of gear and more playstyles to be viable. And the gameplay in general has been smoothed out to be less stiff and more dynamic. If you have never played Outward before, I would definitely recommend going for the Definitive Edition. The Definitive Edition had some pretty annoying bugs at launch, but they have delivered a first patch that fixed some of the issues. Hopefully more patches will be coming. Let's now get to the more detailed review, as I have some good and bad things to say. Let's first go back to the balance changes. Heavy armor is now way more viable than before. The protection stat that reduces physical damage by a flat amount now gives you some impact resistance. You can now trade blows with endgame bosses by wearing heavy armors, making them a very reliable option. Some armors also have barrier now, like the silver and runic armor, which make them interesting against elemental enemies. Good balance changes, and the fact that you get locked in animations a little less than before makes the combat even more enjoyable. The integration of the DLC content is not perfect though. Corruption is now everywhere, even in the first region of the game, and though it has not given me too much trouble, I still feel like they did not give us enough ways to deal with corruption in the base game regions. The corruption used to be only in the Antique Plateau, a region added by the Sorborians DLC, and this region gave you a lot of ways to deal with it, from potions, in enemies and containers loot tables, to food and corruption resistant gear. Most of these things are almost impossible to come by in the base game region, and the only real way to deal with corruption in these areas is to buy corruption resistance potions from the Sorborian Caranier, or corruption decreasing potions from the alchemists in towns. Adding corruption everywhere is not a problem. It makes more sense lore-wise and gives an interesting challenge, but I really feel like they should have given us more ways to deal with it without going to the Antique Plateau. The integration of the Enchantment system, however, is flawless in my opinion. You can now find most of the enchanting ingredients in all the regions, and I was able to get some very good enchantments without ever going to the Antique Plateau. Lots of people were excited about the accessibility of bombs and special arrows in the base game maps, but I think that it was not very well made. You can only get these in supply crates and on some unique new enemies, making bombs and special arrows way too hard to get for consistent use. I was listening to Skooma and he mentioned that it would have been interesting to allow us to buy bomb kits and arrowheads from the Sorborian Caravaneer or maybe blacksmiths in town. But unfortunately it's not the case, and these consumables are still only crafted in the very late game when you begin the city building in Caldera. Kind of a shame that they did not make this into a more accessible thing, especially bombs that are probably going to be overlooked by most of the player base. Since I mentioned city building, let's talk about this. Sample farming was probably the worst mechanic ever implemented in Outward. City building was great, but the fact that you had to farm for random samples failed to turn this into an incentive to explore and made the Caldera questline into a brain-dead sample farm for a lot of players. They seem to have listened to the feedback, as you will now be able to ask for a specific sample from time to time, which makes this part way more enjoyable and less grindy than before. It is not perfect, but it makes this DLC 10 times better. Great improvement. There are some new diseases and death scenarios, and I would say both of these are great. The death scenarios, especially, are finally what they really were supposed to be, and give us some pretty interesting and interactive events. One of them even is the beginning of a new quest. I want to end this review on a more positive note. The new unique enemies and secret rewards. Every single dungeon that did not feature a unique enemy or mini-boss now does. This makes every dungeon worth exploring, and is to me the main appeal of the Definitive Edition. Some of these enemies are incredibly cool, and I have enjoyed myself a lot looking for them and fighting them. They all drop some pretty interesting rewards that used to be quite tricky to get, so fighting them is pretty worth. They also hid some new secret pets you can unlock in the game, and though I will not spoil their location, they are beautiful and make some things worth doing. They slightly revamped the progression in the underground dungeon of the Antique Plateau for the Rust and Vengeance quests, giving you way more freedom and redesigning some areas, and it feels way less linear, so great change too. So what is my final opinion on the Definitive Edition? Should you give it a try? I would say that if you really enjoyed the original Outward, you will probably really like the Definitive Edition. If you never played the original Outward, this version is probably the best way to get into it. It offers more than we expected in the first place, and is overall an improvement. Some of the DLC features are not as well implemented as they could have been, but it's nothing too game-breaking. The Definitive Edition gives every player a new reason to explore the world of Ori. This has been my review for Outward's Definitive Edition. I hope with this will give you enough information for you to make your choice. If you enjoyed this video, do not hesitate to subscribe, as it helps me more than you think. I also stream on Twitch from time to time, so don't hesitate to come if you're interested. I'll see you again. Bye.